They said the old St. Helena County Hospital came down like a gentleman, slow, deliberate, permitting the backhoe to take its time. I stood behind the orange mesh, with a paper cup of coffee cooling in my hands, and thought that was generous. Buildings don't go gently. They groan when memories are pried loose. The brick had the cast of the 1930s, the windows that tall, sock-like shape which once let winter light puddle across polished linoleum. I had worked here as a unit clerk in the 80s, fingers flying over carbon copy forms, clattering down hallways with clipboards, memorizing doctors' names by the rhythm of their complaints. I left when the new regional medical center opened out by the freeway and St. Helena dwindled to night shift and storage. After they shuttered it for good, the pigeons moved in, and the neighborhood learned to look the other way. It was a Tuesday in March when the excavator's bucket nicked a wall that was supposed to be solid. The foreman cussed and waved his hard hat. Dust swarmed like thoughts. When it cleared, the machine had carved a mouth into the ground-level foundation where the old pharmacy once met the laundry chutes. It wasn't a crawl space, it was a doorway squared and bricked up from the inside long ago. No hinges, no latch, no record on the plans the city inspector carried like a shield. The foreman, a cautious man with 3 daughters and a mortgage he could recite, wanted to rebar the hole and pretend it was a mistake. But the crew, men who'd grown up listening to their grandmothers talk about county fairs and charity balls at St. Helena, got quiet. A space like that hums even before you step into it. "Ma'am," the inspector said to me, as if my grey hair gave me jurisdiction. "You worked here, right? What's down there?" "Storage," I said automatically, then heard my own voice and shook my head. "Storage you knew about. This was something else." "I don't know." They rigged a light on an extension cord and fed it into the gap. The beam landed on a sign, screwed crookedly to a concrete column, Basement B, Archive. The foreman whistled the low note men use when a decision has been made without their permission. The bucket pulled away the rest of the brick plug like a dentist tugging an old crown. A draft came out, the stale chill of paper that hasn't been asked to breathe in decades. Someone unspooled caution tape out of habit, but no one stepped forward to put it up. "Give me the light," I said. "Ma'am, we can't." "You can, if I sign your waiver." I smiled the way receptionists do when doctors tell them rules are for other people. "And you will, because if that's an archive, there are patient files down there. If you crush them with that machine, your company will be learning about HIPAA from a man in a blue suit. Let me see what we're dealing with." He looked at the inspector, and the inspector looked at the hole, and the hole looked like it had been waiting for me longer than was comfortable. I eased through, the light in my left hand, the other hand trailing the cool of the wall. Stairs went down, poured concrete, narrow treads, dust thick enough to write in with a fingernail. The air smelled like metal file rails, mildew bullied into submission, and the faintest perfume of camphor that any nurse from the last century would recognize. At the bottom, the room opened into a warren. Rows of steel shelving stood with soldierly patience, and on them grey Hollinger boxes, rope-tied bundles, microfilm canisters labelled in pencil. A clipboard hung on a nail, the top sheet buckled but legible. Archive B Inventory, last updated 1974, Subseries, PHA, Pharmacology, Hospital Applications, Subseries, PSY, Psychiatry, Ward Notes, Subseries, PRJ, Special Projects. That last line had a pencil arrow pointing to room 3 farther in, where light gave up and memory took over. I walked toward it, the beam jittering with my breath. Past me, the 1960s sat on the shelves like a sleeping animal, brown envelopes with wax seals, black binders with corner protectors, glass syringes in hinged tins, memos typed on onion skin with margins full of tight, irritated handwriting. A Polaroid face down on the floor stuck to my shoe. When I peeled it up, an old fluorescent glare stared back. A hospital bed, a tray table, a woman's hand curled against a blanket, nails blush pink with the dutiful vanity of that era. The door to room 3 was not a door so much as a promise. Project Nightjar, painted in white block letters that had bled under the stencil. Beneath it, Access, Director only. My light caught a key hanging on a nail. I wanted to laugh. Institutions love drama. A sign to keep out and the key right there, because when the right person needs to get in, no one wants to be blamed for the delay. The key turned with a voice like gravel and resentment. Inside, the archive forgot to be neutral. It leaned forward. Boxes were labelled by month and year, 1964 through 1968, and by cohort, Heist, PP, Ortho, Pain, Peaceway Women's Ward. I set the light on a shelf and opened the topmost box, fingers clumsy now, as if they understood more than I did. Inside lay consent forms on heavy paper, edges browned, protocol sheets describing doses and schedules, nurses' notes written in long patient cursive, incident reports rubber-stamped in violet. The consent language was as cheerful as a church picnic and as blunt as a hammer. I agree to participate in a study that will improve care for women like me. No mention that women like me meant post-hysterectomy patients who would receive reduced analgesia so their pain responses could be measured, pulse by pulse, tear by tear, against experimental sedatives. I read until the words felt like gravel in my mouth. Nightjar, a bird that hunts at dusk and is blamed wrongly by old folk for stealing milk from orphans. Someone with a sense of poetry and a mean sense of humor had named this project. The grant letters spoke of behavioral compliance post-operatively, of reducing nurse burden by discovering the right cocktail of long-acting tranquilizer and suggestion therapy. The funding agency was a private foundation, now defunct, whose board apparently overlapped with the hospital's if the carbon-copied thank yous meant what they usually mean. A state university pharmacology department had sent 2 fellows to supervise. Their names were typed, their signatures shaky with youth. I reached for a nurse's log and found myself back at a desk I had left decades ago. Pain scale, NA. Patient instructed that discomfort is a signal of healing. Sedation given. Chlorpromazine 50 million IM 0600 1200 1800. Verbal protest minimized via reframing. Good patients are quiet. Your daughter will be proud. Family inquiries redirected to chaplain. The handwriting was neat, unornamented. A good nurse doing what she had been told was right in a time when rules had a male face and questions were insubordination. I turned a card and found a name that stopped my hands before my mind caught up. Margaret L. Escobedo. Admission, June 14, 1966. Procedure, total abdominal hysterectomy. Research cohort, HIST, PP, and under emergency contact L. Moreno, daughter. I set the card down as if the paper could feel me. My mother's maiden name was Margaret Lucia Escobedo. Her surgery year had been 1966. The summer I turned 14, I slept on a chair in our living room, listening to her teeth click against pain she could not describe without apologizing. When she came home, she was quieter. She let her hair grow because she was tired of the mirror. She took a long time to laugh. When I asked once, at 19, whether the hospital had treated her well, she said, "They did what hospitals do," which is the sort of sentence mothers use when the truth won't make you better. I opened the nurse's folder for June 1966 with the tenderness of a person about to confirm an old suspicion she had scolded herself for. June 16th. Patient vocal overnight. Instructed that breathing exercises will convert pain to manageable sensation. June 17th. Analgesic withheld per protocol. Administered study sedative. Patient reports floating, but still writhes during cough. Nurse offered hand to hold. Removed when patient gripped too hard. June 18th. Family attempted to visit out of hours. Redirected. In the margin, in pencil so faint I would have missed it if I hadn't been looking for mercy. This feels wrong. No initials. A confession to the paper, because paper keeps secrets until it is asked to tell. In a separate bundle, I found adverse events, written in the black ink firmness of a man with a title, "One subject reported nightmares and thrashing. Considered behavioral, continue protocol, maintain composure on the ward, tone of reassurance is essential. Beneath that, a note clipped at a diagonal. Chaplain reports increased confessions concerning pain tests. Advised chaplain to focus on forgiveness themes, not justice. I felt absurdly like I needed to knock before reading the next line of my mother's life. I read anyway. The microfilm box for 1966 waited like a sealed letter. I found the reader against the far wall, a hulking grey machine from a time when future and heavy were synonyms. I hauled it to the door, waved the men upstairs, and we wrestled an extension cord down. The bulb flickered, then warmed into a flickering circle that made my stomach remember night shifts and APS alarms from another lifetime. I threaded the film, clicked past budgets and meeting minutes until a heading hissed into view. PRJ Nightjar, Cohort Heist PP, Summaries. The frame had tables, blood pressure, pulse, verbalization indices. At the bottom, handwritten, remarkable reductions in nurse interventions during nights 2 to 4. Another frame, consent form template V3. It came with a script. Mrs. J. Shi, women like you are helping us learn how to make post-surgical recovery easier for future mothers and sisters. A blank for the patient to sign. A blank for a witness who did not have to be family. Behind me, at the top of the stairs, I heard the foreman clear his throat. "Ma'am?" I blinked in the machine's glow. "Yes. We need to know. Is this important?" "It's not just important," I said, surprised my voice did not echo. "It's people we love, written down by strangers." He came down 2 steps and stopped at the threshold of the room with Project Nightjar stenciled on it. "We can pause the machines," he said, "but not forever." "Pause them long enough," I said, "to make sure this does not go into the landfill, and long enough for me to read one more name." I turned the knob, and pages of light flew past. When I slowed them, my own reflection hovered on the glass, a woman whose hair had thinned into honesty, whose hands had learned the weight of charts and casseroles and condolence. The next patient card stopped under my finger. Escobedo, Margaret L. again, this time with a stamp in red. Follow-up. Improved composure, residual pain outbursts, family instructed in supportive silence. The phrase lodged behind my ribs like a broken key. Supportive silence. I know now what it meant. It meant we were taught to be proud of tolerating what should never have been asked of us. It meant my mother's pain was data, and so was our endurance. I switched the machine off and sat in the darkness with the light still in my eyes. The foreman shifted on the step, uncertain if he should breathe. I breathed for both of us. "Get me a phone," I said. "I'm going to call the county archivist, the state attorney general's office, and a reporter who knows how to spell ethics. And when we do this, we will do it right. We will not turn this into a haunted hospital story. We will tell the story of women, of nurses who wrote, 'This feels wrong' in pencil, of men who believed efficiency was mercy. We will put names back in mouths that forgot them. And then, because a woman my age knows a good cliff has its place," I added quietly, mostly to myself, "and we will ask St. Helena what else it has been hiding in its walls." Midday, I turned the key in the nightjar door once more, as if to warn it that the dark had had a long, uninterrupted run. It was time for light. Dive out of a building that is trying not to exist. You don't know how much of your back a truth requires. We hauled 57 Hollinger boxes, 8 Bankers boxes, and 4 crates of microfilm up those narrow stairs in a human chain that included 2 ironworkers, the foreman's oldest daughter on spring break, a librarian from the community college who arrived with 2 rolls of Tyvek, and a pastor who'd come to watch and stayed to work. County Records sent a van and a woman named Sharon who wore neutral gloves like jewelry and had the kind of practical reverence archivists are famous for. No genuflection, all care. On the second day, the reporter from the Daily came with a photographer who resisted every urge to point his lens at chipped paint and broken windows. "We photograph paper," he said, "and hands turning it." He took a shot of the consent forms with their cheery lies, and a shot of the nurse's note with the whisper of dissent. He did not take a picture of my mother's name. That was mine to carry. Sharon and I set up a triage table in a borrowed room at the county library. We sorted protocols, cohort lists, grant letters, meeting minutes, adverse event logs, and the part that made my throat go tight every time, letters from patients' families stapled to bills, asking politely why recovery had become humiliation. Some of the letters had never been mailed. They lived in a file marked drafts. I could see the nurse who had tucked them there, hoping someone above her pay grade would read what she dared not send. We sent a public records request to the state university that had provided the pharmacology fellows. Weeks later came a soft packet, polite responses from the Office of General Counsel, a course catalogue from 1965 that made a virtue of clinical efficiency, and a thin folder of fellowship reports written in the buoyant tone of young men who believe in progress like other people believe in hymns. Nightjar shows promise, one wrote. Sedation combined with cognitive reframing yields acceptable noise levels on post-op nights without heavy narcotics. Noise levels. That phrase made me want to stand on a table in the county library and use a voice that would make those fellows flinch across time. The State Attorney General's office assigned an investigator named Ruth Levin, a woman with hair the color of verdicts and the bedside manner of a stern aunt. She sat across from me, gloves on, and read until her shoulders squared into decision. "We are not here to prosecute the dead," she said. "We are here to make a record that lives can fit inside." She subpoenaed the hospital board, minutes from the era, and found what I expected and what still made me dizzy. The Foundation's chair, a hardware store magnate who built a wing for newborns so the paper would spell his name, had pushed to standardize recovery experiences. Standardize. That great blunt verb of the 60s. Ruth tracked down 2 living witnesses. One was a retired orderly, Mr. Earl Booker, who had joined St. Helena in 1964 and left within a year. He walked into the library with a cap in his hands and a face that had learned to carry regret without complaint. "We were told," he said, "that it was better for the ladies if they didn't make a fuss. Less agitation, they called it. The nurses didn't like it. One of them, Dottie with the green eyes, wrote me a note after I left, said she couldn't square what she knew with what they told her. I burned that note. I thought I was protecting her." "From what?" I asked. "From me not having the courage to bring it where it belonged," he said, and the room grew gentle around him to let the sentence fit. The other witness was Dr. Thomas Kincaid, once one of the fellows, now 81, a man whose hearing aids whistled when he grew excited. He sat with Ruth and me in a quiet room, took off his glasses, and rubbed the place on his nose where time's fingers press. "We measured," he said simply. "We measured so much we forgot that counts are not the same as kindness. They told us the consent forms were adequate. They told us it was a pain perception study to reduce addiction risks. They told us a lot of things that made sense if you didn't ask whether you would want your mother in that bed." He folded his hands like a boy at a school desk. "I'm sorry, not in the cheap way, in the way that wakes you up at 3 in the morning. We asked about supportive silence," that phrase stamped in red beneath my mother's file. He closed his eyes. "We were enamored of the notion that attitude could modulate pain," he said. "There was a fashion to it. Doctors love fashions. It allows them to feel sane in the midst of suffering. We coached families to be calm, to praise compliance. We told ourselves it would help. We did not calculate the cost in dignity. I went home that night and set my mother's photograph on the kitchen table and told her aloud what Dr. Kincaid had said. My husband, who has learned that conversation with the dead is really conversation with yourself, poured me tea and sat without commentary. My mother's smile in the photo is the smile of a woman who baked for bake sales and saved buttons just in case. And I touched the corner of the picture with my finger. They made a science out of telling us to be quiet, I said, and we believed them. We found, in the depths of PRJ Nightjar, a memo dated January 1967. It was small and bland and devastating. Increased community concern regarding rumors of pain tests. Recommendation: consolidate storage of all Nightjar documentation in Archive B, Room 3. Access limited to director. Public relations to emphasize Foundation's contributions to maternal care. Under it, in the same tight, annoyed hand I'd seen before, a note: demolition of old pharmacy will permit bricking of secondary entrance. That was the wall the excavator had nicked. That was the mouth that had opened to let me in. Sharon pushed for an exhibit, not a spectacle but a reading room with copies. She wrote labels with a teacher's economy. Consent as courtesy, not clarity. Efficiency as ethics. Nurse's pencil, doctor's ink. She did not make villains. She made systems visible. People came, men in good jackets who had welcomed their own wives home from gallbladder surgery last year and could not imagine being told that a groan was unladylike. Women who had lived it and folded it into mystery because it had no public name. There were not many tears. Not in the room. The tears happened later, in cars, on porches, over sinks with water running. A local radio host asked me to speak, and I did, knowing that air does what it wants with words. I spoke of my mother, of June 1966, of supportive silence. I said, I do not want a witch hunt. I want the word apology to enter the county's vocabulary without choking. The county commissioner, a careful man who had run on fiscal restraint and pothole repair, called me the next day. We will make a statement, he said, if you help me write it. We wrote it at my table, where casserole dishes have cooled and grandchildren have spilled milk, and no one has ever been told to stop, because noise is merely proof that life continues. We used short sentences. We avoided the coward's passive voice. We made room for the nurses, whose pencil note had said, "This feels wrong." We asked the state university to co-sign. They did. On a Saturday in June, under the trees outside the library, the county read the statement. People stood in loose clusters like families after a funeral when the food has been put away and the real business begins. The commissioner took the microphone and said, in the 1960s, at St. Helena County Hospital, an experiment called Project Nightjar was conducted on post-operative women without clear informed consent. Pain relief was withheld or reduced. Sedation and suggestion were used to encourage a quiet ward. We recognize this as harm. We apologize. He said apologize with the dignity of a man who understands the word is not a coin, but a tool. The state university's representative read her part and did not attempt to defend youth, funding pressures, or fashions in medicine. We are sorry, she said. We will use this record to teach. Mr. Booker, the retired orderly, stood with his cap in his hands. Dr. Kincaid wept into a handkerchief he had ironed, then shook my husband's hand as if my husband had any business accepting that grief. The pastor gave a benediction in which he refused to bless erasure. He blessed instead the pencil and the women who used it, the men who learned to listen late, the archivists who label without flinching, and the backhoe operator whose bucket found the seam. After the microphones were folded, after the cookies were eaten, after the library staff wheeled the copies back inside, a woman I did not know touched my elbow. Margaret was my aunt, she said, and my bones recognized the name before my ears. She meant another Margaret, one of the file cards that had kept me awake, Margaret D., cohort, Heist PP, whose family address had been the next street over from mine in 1966. We sat on the library steps and compared memories, little domestic artifacts that never make it into archives. A lemon cake recipe, the way a laugh can go absent for a season. A dress no longer worn because its fabric remembers a hospital corridor. We said her name aloud, and the air did not crack. The county funded a small scholarship for nursing students who take an ethics elective Sharon designed with Ruth's help. Paper cuts, documentation, dignity, and the duty to refuse. Dr. Kincaid asked to endow it quietly from a savings account that had sat, like his regret, mostly untouched. He brought the check in an envelope and apologized for the tremor in his signature. No one mentioned the whistling hearing aids. The hospital site is a rectangle of grass now. They say a clinic may rise there someday, with windows that open. There is a plaque by the sidewalk, the kind you might miss if you were late to an appointment. It reads, "In this place women taught a county the difference between quiet and peace. A spoon rests in my kitchen drawer that belonged to my mother, sturdy, dull, good at lifting stew. Some mornings I stir oatmeal and think of Archive B and the dust that tasted like old pennies, and I whisper something, not a prayer, not exactly. A wish that every nurse who ever wrote in pencil finds, somewhere, a reader with a light and a spine." People ask what we did with the nightjar boxes. We kept them. We copied them. We indexed them with names that families can claim and names they can keep private. We teach with them. We resist the melodrama that would make them instruments in a haunted tale. This is not a ghost story. It is a ledger of harm and of the work it takes to count it honestly. The ledger is long. It invites more names than mine, but it has a first line you can read even in dim light. This feels wrong. If that sentence is the only thing the next generation learns to write sooner and darker, then the backhoe did more than demolish a building. It opened a room and let air do what air does best, remind us we were made to breathe.